Welcome to another Dragon Quest Builders 2 video, and in this episode I'm going to be looking at Fanciness and going into all the details because it seemed to be like underexplained, or at least I felt like I was missing a lot of information and there was a lot of guessing involved. So I've spent an unrealistic amount of time testing it, so I felt like I might as well make a video about it. First off, I'm going to go over some of the basics, and then the main part of the video will be going into like the details. And at the end, I'll show off how I tested these things, in case anyone wants to see how it was done or if they want to do it themselves. So, without further ado, let's jump into some of the basics. So when it comes to seeing Fanciness, you need to be in a room, and off to the left, it's a small natural private bedroom, and there's a little yellow star. That shows how fancy it is. It's also on one of the yellow bar, so there's size then Fanciness. And on the Fanciness bar, you can see there's little lines that mark the different levels of Fanciness. And then the other important thing to note is at the bottom it says residence. And it says Rosie, and there are 3 hearts. That middle heart is their Fanciness. It's the Fanciness level that they want, and so right now we can see that Rosie does not have the level of Fanciness that she wants. Otherwise the heart would also be colored in. If you want a more detailed view on what a resident wants for their Fanciness, you want to go to your residence register. Then you can click down, and they have that little speech bubble off to the right. You will not have this initially. You have to reach a certain point in the story for this to pop up. But once you get there, it'll be off to this size, and so it says she wants a size of 2 hearts, she wants a Fanciness of 1 heart, and the ambience of natural. Alright? So we'll keep that in mind, because there's a very important detail there that is really not explained. So if you come in here again, we can see that it's 2, the blue bars filled up 2 spaces, so she's happy. The Fanciness, if you look at the top, is 1 star, but she's not happy because it's actually 1 star too many. So when a resident says they want a 1 heart, or what do they use to mark it? So if we go back here, we can see she says Fanciness of 1 heart. And if you go back here, we have a 1 star. But that's not what she wants, because when it comes to the stars, you need to -1, I guess. So if you look at the Fanciness bar, you can see that the yellow goes past the first tick. Well, she doesn't want it to go past the first tick. She wants it to stay before the first tick, which means there should be 0 stars at the top. So if a resident says that they want a 3 star, you would need to have 4 up top, I think. So what we can do is, I've gone ahead and put this in here because I knew it would make it too fancy. So now it should remove the star, and she should now be happy. There we go. So a 1 heart means 0 stars. Alright, so I think that's all the information I have to say for like the most basic stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and jump over to my testing island, and we'll see you in a second. Alright, here we are on my testing grounds for this experiment. The next thing I wanted to note was that the size of the room doesn't matter. So I've seen that pop up in some places where it's like, to make a fancy room, make it real small. From what I've seen, it doesn't make a difference. So here we can see that we are 1 star in this massive room, and if we were to make this into a smaller room, it will stay the same Fanciness. So the size changed, but the Fanciness really didn't. So if we just take this down, the Fanciness pretty much stays the same. When it comes to the Fanciness of items, I found that there were certain numbers that always came up. What I would do was see how many of an object it takes to make a room 1 star fancy, and then I'd write down that number. And I found that when it comes to placing items, there's certain numbers that almost always hit. There were a couple of ones that were like one off from the rest, and I feel like something was wrong there on my end. Like I tested it wrong, but I tested it over and over and over again, but it still was one more than all the rest, but that's beside the point. So some of the main things I noticed was like for the fanciest stuff, it takes 2 items, and that is like this guy. It takes only 2 to make this room 1-star fancy. There's a couple of these things, though they're probably the rarest. The next is 4 items, then 5 items, 13 items, 39 items, and 65. Now, in all honesty, the actual number isn't as important. It's more like their tiers. So I'm going to have, and linked down below, the worksheet. And what I'm going to try to do is have a column where you can filter by, and it'll be like the tiers of items. So, you know, this would be like the first tier because it's like number 1. It only takes 2 items, best tier. And then go down from there. Also linked down below will be a Google Sheet link to it's like an encyclopedia. It has everything for this game. It's incredible. But I did end up using the Itempedia as a template, which saved me a lot of time because I didn't have to write down every single item, all of its ambience and all of that. It was already written down. I just made a new column and I've put my own numbers into it, but I want you all to be able to find where I got the original from. So those will both be linked down below. But what it looks like to have 39 of an object, which isn't even the worst object, it looks something like this. So it takes that many to make this room fancy. And that's not even the worst for placeable items. 65? Yeah, 65 is the worst. On the spreadsheet, there'll also be, besides all of the standard numbers that I talked about, plus some bigger ones for like wall and floor materials. But there's some NAs, and what that means is after placing 64 or 65 of that particular object, I didn't see fanciness going up, I said NA. It may have some level of fanciness, but I feel like if you need more than 64 of that object, it's probably not all that practical, and in essence, 0. So that's why some of them are marked with an NA. It's not because they necessarily don't have one, it's just it's bigger, or there's like, you need more than is logical to make a room, so I just count them as not having one. But since you are here, you may be looking to try to get a room to be fancy, and if that is the case, here is a whole row of things that is the like top tier fanciness. You only need 2 of them. There are a couple more, but I don't have access to them at the moment. So we've got these double doors, this brazier, this wall light, Bab's wall light, this bed, which is the king size bed, the princess bed, which needs a lot of space. We need this toasty table, which is a DLC item. We've got the round table, the royal dining table, the grand piano, grandfather clock, the big bold banner. Oh no, need a bit of snow to place that guy. Is too tall. This guy. We've got this big old clock. We've got this face and the Dragon Quest sign. So these are all things that, as you can see, are quite fancy. There are some general rules, but they're not always the case when it comes to trying to guess what level of fanciness they have. So things that are natural, so leaves, flowers, those kind of things, for the most part I found they're an NA, they don't have a whole lot of fanciness on them. Something else that really doesn't often have much fanciness is anything with the flamboyant tag. I find that if there's two of the same thing, but one's cool, one's flamboyant, the flamboyant one is going to be way less fancy. And then, as kind of a general rule, if you have to use gold to craft on it, it's going to be in the upper levels. So, not necessarily just 2, but they may only take, 2, 4, 5, or 13. So they take fewer than things without gold. So there's some kind of rules. Like I said before, they're not necessarily strict rules, because there is a wall that is flamboyant, that is very fancy. That is the, it is this one. So it is flamboyant, but it is also very fancy. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not a strict rule, but it is something you can kind of get a general idea from. Which is kind of annoying, because the king from Moonbrook, he wants a fancy room of the flamboyant type. Now, getting both of those to happen at the same time is very difficult. Finally, I want to look at the weirdest thing that I discovered, which involves doors and pairing up. I'll have to set up an experiment for that, though. This is how many doors it takes to get a room, a 1-star, just these doors placed in it, okay? And you'll note that these are not paired. It takes 39 doors. However, here, let's see. Should drop down, yep. However, if we pair them, it takes less doors. So when it took, for the singles, it took 39. For a pair, it only takes 13 pairs, which is 26 doors. So if you're trying to do something super fancy, you have to use these double doors. Pair them. But I think the opposite is true for the jail cells. It's actually, you can get a fancier building by having them separated by one than as a pair, because I think it takes 39 doors to make a room fancy and 39 pairs of doors. So then it actually takes double. So that's the first thing to keep in mind for the weirdest thing that I ran into in testing. So when it comes to wall and floor blocks, so these kinds of things, they're not necessarily wall or floor blocks, but just what they're usually used for. I have not finished testing them, especially including things like all of the natural blocks, because I want to be able to trust my instincts, but every time I do, but I test it, I'm wrong. So I'm just going to test everything, but if I waited until it was completely done, this video would never happen. So I'm still in the process of testing all of these, but for the most part I've gotten through some of them. But I know that none of them are as fancy as items. So you're not going to find any wall piece, from what I've seen so far, that only takes 2. But you can have ones that are pretty fancy. So like the silver block, I don't think it takes many to get a room fancy with it. Just 17. Whereas something with the Adobe wall, it's 195. And I know I said that after 64 I was stopping with placeable items, but I don't think it's unreasonable to count these, because you're just going to, as a rule of thumb, have more wall and floor blocks than what you're going to have placed. Speaking of which, however, when it comes to fanciness, it should be noted, and this should have been at the beginning, but I didn't think of it, the only thing that counts towards the fanciness are things from these 2 walls and the floor. So that guy is not counting towards the fanciness, and that includes items. So your items can't go above this wall, and they can't go below this. You can have items like if you want to hide, so for example, you can have a table and a candle, and the candle will count, but you can't have like a stage with a table and then a candle. The candle won't count. This items on this space does count, so you can put like sneaky things if you're trying to make it fancier than it looks. You could sneak stuff under here. I like to put my sign there and put like a bookcase underneath it, but you need to place the bookcase like so, and then you can just place this underneath there. And it still counts just fine, and then you just put your snow back, or your floor. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. The fanciness only counts these, this, and that. 3 blocks. It also should be noted that when it comes to solid blocks and rooms and what's accepted, things right down here do not count because they aren't like visible to the room. So anything under the wall and past the floor doesn't count. You could put a whole bunch of gold down there and this room still would be 0 stars. Another thing to keep in mind. I think that's all that I have to say. Like I said, there's the sheet down below, which will have filters and stuff so you can easily look through it. If you want to have your own copy that you can edit, you can go to File and then Save as Copy. Yeah, File, Make a Copy. And then you can edit it for yourself or color code it or do what you need to make it more useful for you. With that all out of the way, I'll go ahead and just talk briefly about how I did the testing so that you can do it yourself if you'd like. I have all snow walls. And the whole floor is snow because it doesn't seem to have any fanciness. And then the one thing that does have fanciness is this right here, the thing that makes it a room. I don't think there would have been a way to set up this to be a room without a door, but it's been consistent the whole time. And like I said, the exact number isn't as important as like getting them grouped up in tiers. So that is how I did that. And then any objects I was willing to place right next to each other, but anything like these bookcases, I would always make sure there was like a space between them. Or when I'm testing like floor or wall blocks, I'd go ahead and use this tool to change them out, or do it like this. When it got the walls no longer were enough, I would also go down into the floor. Things like doors, like you saw, I always had spaces between them because you want the room to still be able to detect it. You don't want it to become separate rooms or it won't work very well. This is also an entirely separate save from my main game so that I can use the go up into the Buildopedia items and buy things if I don't have them. And then I just don't save. I'll back out without saving so that I don't use up those points. So that's why there's certain things I have scores for but don't have access to in this save. It's just because I just didn't save going through the work to get the item just to test it, so that I continue to have enough points to test the rest of the items. So I hope you guys have found this to be useful in some capacity. It's certainly been a lot of time of testing, so I hope somebody finds it useful. I think it's nice, so I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode, and until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day.